what we get today is the Alpha Omega Convention extended. Okay, so I gave this message in Weed on Sunday, and I shared yesterday in chapel that I had given that, was kind of excited about it. And I thought, well, since Pastor Brewster can't come, I'd like to share that with the students in chapel. So I'm going to be giving this in 2 parts today, and then the second part on Friday. So you'll have to stay tuned. But you can see the title, The Temple Mount and Islam. When we think about the Temple Mount today, I can think of no other place on the face of the earth that is more sensitive politically and religiously than this little plot of ground called the Temple Mount, or the Noble Sanctuary, to Muslims. Why is that so? And particularly, why should Muslims be so interested in the Temple Mount? That's an interesting question, I think a good question, because Islam is really focused on and centered on the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, where it was born, where it gave birth, and the 2 holy sites of Islam are located in Mecca and Medina. To answer that question, why the Temple Mount is so interested, it finds so much interest in Islam, I'd like to give 2 answers. I'll give the first answer today, the second answer on Friday. The first answer is the purported answer. That is the answer that is given, the answer that's for public consumption, the answer that they'd like everybody to believe. And my thesis is that this is not the correct answer, but it's sort of the answer given for PR purposes. And that answer is all wrapped up in the so-called sanctity of the Noble Sanctuary in Islam. You frequently hear that this site is the 3rd holiest site in Islam. And that is based on a Muslim tradition known as the nighttime journey of Muhammad to Jerusalem. And I want to discuss with you the validity, the reliability, and the historical background of that nighttime journey and where it comes from and what that's all about. It is known as Al-Isra and Al-Mi'raj, and it comes to us from the 17th surah of the Quran. But before we go to that, I want to go to the Bible and talk about the significance of the Temple Mount to the Jews. Because while Muslims may claim the Temple Mount as the 3rd holiest site to Islam, we should always remember that the Temple Mount is the 1st holiest site in Judaism. For example, Deuteronomy chapter 12 tells us in verse 5, "But you shall seek Yahweh at the place which Yahweh your God will choose from all your tribes to establish his name there for his dwelling, and there you shall come." Now this was told to Moses at the time of the Exodus. It was not revealed to Moses where that place would be, although in the Song of Moses it's also defined as a mountain in the place where they will be going. But there is a place that the Lord would select, that the Lord would reveal to them, and it was that place where they were to come to worship. And then verse 11 says, "Then it shall come about that the place in which Yahweh your God will choose for his name to dwell, there you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the contribution of your hand, and all the choice votive offerings which you will vow to the Lord." Now we know that the place was actually discovered later, much later, during the reign of David, when he conquers the city from the Jebusites. And then late in the reign of David, there is a plague that comes and he purchases the threshing floor of Aravna the Jebusite. That becomes the place. But way earlier than this, it had already been a focal point of the worship of the Lord when Abraham was led to the mountains of Moriah to offer his son Isaac. And that was the place, the same place. Mount Moriah is Mount Zion, is the Temple Mount, is the place of the foundation stone, and very likely the place where Adam was created and then later placed into the Garden of Eden to the east. So in terms of the people of God in the Old Testament, the nation of Israel, the Temple Mount is the 1st holiest place. But Muslims today claim the Temple Mount as the third holiest site, and this is given as the reason why they have such intense interest in the Temple Mount. There was an interesting thing that occurred recently. Now, let me give you the background to this article first of all. In 1967, Israel fought a war with the surrounding Arab nations, and as a result of that war, the modern-day nation of Israel gained control over eastern Jerusalem, which is where the Temple Mount is located. Prior to that time, it had been under the control of the Jordanians, and before that, of course, it had been under the Ottoman Empire and so forth. So for the first time, really, since the temple had stood, the Jews had once again control over the location of their temple, and there was great rejoicing. However, in order to avoid further conflict with the Arabs, they left the control of the upper part of the Temple Mount, the platform where the temple and the other structures used to stand, the plaza, so to speak. They left the control of that part in the hands of what's known as the Muslim Waqf, W-A-Q-F. That's the Muslim trust, which is in control of the Muslim holy sites, or the Muslim buildings and mosques and so forth. And I'll show you in a few moments the two main structures that are there on the Temple Mount. But the surrounding areas, and particularly the western wall where the Jews had come for years and years and years to pray, was under Israeli control. Now, just recently, just in this last few weeks or so, there has arisen a situation in Israel that has caused the Muslim Waqf to expand its claim of control over the Temple Mount to include the walls around it. And so with that background, take a look at this. Well, let me say one more thing. The western wall, where the Jews pray, has been divided into two sections. Okay? At the north part of it is a section for men to go and pray. And then there's a barrier, and then south of that, a section for the women to pray. And so you don't violate that custom. But there, as is true just about all over the world, there is in Israel a sort of a women's liberation movement, even in Judaism. So there's a group of ladies in Israel known as the Women of the Wall. And they have been complaining because they don't have access to the men's section, and they're not allowed to wear the tefillin and the prayer shawls, and they aren't allowed to say the same prayers that the men pray. And so they've been saying, we want to be able to do this. So just in the last couple of weeks, Israel has decided to designate a third area along the western wall, further to the south, for egalitarian prayer, where men and women can go and pray together, and the women who pray can wear whatever kind of religious paraphernalia they want to. They can say whichever prayers they want, okay? So obviously there are a lot of religious Jews that are opposed to that, but the nation of Israel said, no, we've got to do this, so they're going to go ahead and do it. You wouldn't think that the Muslims would even care what the Jews do in their part of the wall, but they do. And this has come up, and this is the background to this article that appeared in the March 2016 issue of Tower magazine, which says, quote, the Palestinian Authority's Minister of Waqf and Religious Affairs, Yusuf Idais, has called the plan for egalitarian section of the prayer in the Western Wall, quote, another Israeli attempt to change the status quo at the Temple Mount, and watch this, and Judaize a holy Islamic site. So the Muslim Waqf, which has had control over the Temple Mount, is now claiming control and rights even to the Western Wall. The Jews, he declared, have, quote, no connection whatever to the structures, and he's referring to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, the yards, referring to the platform up on top, the walls, and the gates. So this just illustrates the claim, the intense claim that the Muslims are making to the Temple Mount today. This goes on to say the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Sheikh Mohammed Hussein, has described the area as, quote, the property of the Islamic Waqf, and slammed the plans for an egalitarian section as, quote, a brutal attack on the Waqf and additional evidence of the Israeli aggression against the Muslim holy places. Amazing. Well, but this is happening. And it is a very, very sensitive and hot area, piece of geography on the planet Earth today. So let's come to their claim to the Temple Mount, and it is based on a single verse in the Quran, in Surah 17. Of course, the Quran is divided into surahs. These are like chapters. Each chapter has several verses. This particular surah is entitled the Al-Isra and Al-Mir'aj. And this has to do with a nighttime journey that Muhammad took from Mecca to what is referred to as the farthest mosque. This is all it says in the Quran. Here is verse 1. Glory to Allah, who did take his servant for a journey by night from the sacred mosque, which is the Kaaba, the black stone in Mecca, from the sacred mosque, whose precinct we did bless, in order that we might show him some of our signs, for he is the one who heareth and seeth. So he goes from the sacred mosque to what's called here the farthest mosque. Now the farthest mosque here in Arabic is Al-Aqsa. Al-Aqsa is translated the farthest mosque. And there is a mosque on the Temple Mount called Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so what is claimed here is that Muhammad journeyed from Mecca to Jerusalem, and from there then that is the Al-Isra, is the journey to Jerusalem, and then the Al-Mi'raj is the journey from there then up into heaven, to take a tour of heaven, to see all kinds of things, and then come back and then return to Mecca. So his ascension to heaven was just a temporary brief visit, and then he came back. Now this says nothing, of course, about Jerusalem. It does say Al-Aqsa, but it does not mention Jerusalem. In fact, Jerusalem is never mentioned even once in the entire Quran. And there is a reason for that, and I'll explain what that reason is in just a moment. But the expansion of this verse, the interpretation of this verse, is given in what's called the Hadith, which is the tradition based on the Quran, which was written many, many years later. Here's the expansion from the Hadith, or at least an explanation of it, and I've just lifted this out of Wikipedia. Hadith. From various Hadith, we learn much greater detail. The Isra is the part of the journey of Muhammad from Mecca to Jerusalem. It began when Muhammad was in the Masjid al-Haram, and the archangel Jibril, which is Gabriel, came to him and brought Burak. Burak is the winged horse that the prophets ride on, okay? So Jibril brings Burak to Muhammad in Mecca, the traditional heavenly steed of the prophets. Burak carried Muhammad to the Masjid al-Aqsa, the farthest mosque, in Jerusalem. Now this is the hadith that is identifying it as Jerusalem. Muhammad alighted, tethered Burak to the Temple Mount, and performed prayer where on God's command he was tested by Jibril. It was told by Anas ibn Malik that Muhammad said, quote, Jibril brought me a vessel of wine, a vessel of water, and a vessel of milk, and I chose the milk, Jibril said. You have chosen the fitra, natural instinct. In the second part of the journey, the mi'raj, an Arabic word that literally means ladder, Burak took him to the heavens, where he toured the 7 stages of heaven and spoke with the earlier prophets such as Ibrahim, Moses, Musa, John the Baptist, and Isa, or Jesus. Muhammad was then taken to the Sidrat al-Muntaha, the holy tree in the 7th heaven that Jibril was not allowed to pass, and so on and so forth. So this is the story that is given in the Hadith about Muhammad's visit to heaven, his journey to the farthest mosque, the Al-Aqsa. So what do we make of all this? Is the Hadith correct? Is that what was in the mind of the author of Surah 17, or what? In order to help you understand that, let's go through a brief chronology, and we'll do that in just a moment. But first, let me just show you basically what is here on the Temple Mount. This is an aerial picture of the Temple Mount, And the walls around the Temple Mount here are the same retaining walls that stood in the days of the Lord Jesus when there was a temple up on top. And so what we're looking at here, this is the plaza within these walls. And I call it the Temple Mount. It doesn't look very much like a mountain, but you can see down here, this is sloping downwards. This is the Kidron Valley down here. And actually all around, you can see this is all lower than the top here. In order to build something on top of a mountain, today what we do is we move in big earth-moving equipment and we level off the mountain. But they didn't have D7 cats in the first century. Even in the first century BC, they didn't. So instead what they did was they built these retaining walls on the four sides, and then would fill in and then lay paving stones on top to make a flat space. So that's the Temple Mount. So it's called a mountain, but it's a flat plaza on top. On the Temple Mount today, there are two main structures. One at the southern end, and this is the southern end down here, is Al-Aqsa Mosque. It is named Al-Aqsa Mosque after the Surah 17. But we'll see that it was actually built much later. The second structure, the one that most people are familiar with, is the Dome of the Rock up here further north. The Dome of the Rock actually stands over the site of the Holy of Holies. Underneath this dome is the foundation stone. It's really the peak of this mountain, the peak of Mount Moriah. It actually juts up through the paving stones at this point. And when we went to Israel in the past, years ago, we used to be able to go inside both of these structures. The Muslims have shut them down to unbelievers, and we can no longer go inside. But I have at home some 35 millimeter slides that I've taken inside both of these. But you can't go in, you can't photograph anymore. It's all off limits. But this Dome of the Rock is not a mosque. The Dome of the Rock actually is a memorial building. And you can see it's octagonally shaped. It's actually patterned after Byzantine memorial buildings that are eight-sided if they're memorials. But it was constructed by the Muslims. The mosque, the place of worship, is down here on the southern side. So keep that all in mind. We're going to go over some of these features in some of the slides that are coming up. But let's think about now a little bit of the chronology. Muhammad is born in 570 AD, and he is born in Mecca. In 608, the Kaaba in Mecca is erected. The Kaaba is the black stone. It's the place where the Muslims go to worship. Big, huge thing once a year. It's a great big tent-like structure with a black stone in the midst of it. It's called the Kaaba. In 621 was when Muhammad had his vision of the Isra and the Mi'raj. That's the nighttime journey. So fix that date in your mind, 621, the nighttime journey of Muhammad to the farthest mosque. In 622, we have the Hijrah. This is Muhammad's flight from Mecca to Medina, a very key point in the development of Islam. 630, Mecca is conquered by Muhammad and becomes the focal point of Islam, the capital, I guess, if you will, of the Islamic Empire. 632, Muhammad dies and is succeeded by the first caliph. The first caliph is Abu Bakr. He becomes caliph in 632, the same year that Muhammad dies. From 633 to 637, we have the first expansion of Islam outside of Saudi Arabia, as the Muslims drive their way northward, making conversion by the edge of the sword, and the Arabs conquered Syria, Iraq, and Egypt, including most of the Holy Land. 638, the Arabs achieved full control of the Holy Land, including Jerusalem. And so it is in 638 that Caliph Omar enters Jerusalem and constructs at this time the very first Al-Aqsa Mosque. Prior to 638, there is no mosque in Jerusalem. There is no Al-Aqsa Mosque prior to 638. But remember that Muhammad's Isra and Mi'raj vision is in 621. So that casts some doubt then on the hadith that identifies the Al-Aqsa Mosque as this location in Jerusalem. Well, we continue on. By 640 to 643, the Arabs conquer Persia. Of course, it was the Persians under Cyrus who allowed the Jews to return to Israel and rebuild the temple. Quite an irony of history that today the Persians, who go by the name the Iranians, are the very ones who want to wipe Israel off the face of the map. But they were conquered by the Arabs and by the Muslims in 640 through 643. 650 is really the first time you have an official version of the Quran that is put out. And this comes during the reign of Caliph Uthman. 685, you have the big major split in Iraq, or in Islam, between the Shiites and the Sunnites, the Shia-Sunna split. 691 now, Caliph Abd al-Malik is the one who commissions the building of the second building on the Temple Mount, second Islamic building. That is the Dome of the Rock. So again, the Muslims are claiming the sanctity of the site because it's from the foundation stone, they say, that Muhammad ascended into heaven. There's actually an indentation in the side of that foundation stone. You can see it if you can get into the Dome of the Rock, where they believe that Muhammad left a footprint of his heel when he took off for heaven. And the Muslims go in there, they touch that impression, and then they kiss their hand, and then they go on. You can imagine how many germs are spread that way. But at any rate, 691 was when the Dome of the Rock was first constructed. The original dome was wooden. Later it was covered with brass. In 1448 they covered it with lead, but they were afraid that the immense weight of that lead dome would cause a collapse, and so finally it was covered in anodized aluminum. As recently as 1993, King Hussein of Jordan took $1 million out of his own bank account and covered that aluminum with 24-karat gold foil. And that's the dome that you see today, why it's so resplendent and brilliant when the sun shines on it. Coming back to our chronology, in 705, a rebuilt Al-Aqsa Mosque was completed, very similar to the one that we see today now. And just a few pictures. Here is an interesting picture of the Dome of the Rock over the foundation stone from 1887. It's a print, and it shows you a little bit about what that looked like. But what I really want to take a look at is this next picture from about the same period of time. Oh no, well, yeah, this one also. This is interesting because this is the temple in Jerusalem is depicted as the Dome of the Rock on the printer's mark of Marco Antonio Giustiniani in Venice, 1545 to 1552. And if we had more time, I'd call on Dr. Brown to translate that all around the edge, but I'll spare him. But what's interesting about this is there is some debate about whether the Dome of the Rock actually stands over the site of the temple. But this is depicting the temple under the figure of the Dome of the Rock. So at least it was understood at this point in history that the Dome of the Rock did represent the actual site of the temple. But now, take a look at this next picture, though. Here is from the late 19th century, late 1800s, an actual photograph of the Dome of the Rock. And I want you to notice several things about this picture. Number one, take a look at the weeds growing up through the foundation, through the pavement stones. Does this look like the third holiest site in Islam? Unkempt, uncared for, full of weeds? And how many people do you see here? How many worshipers are attending this third holiest site in Islam in the late 1800s? Not a one. The place is totally vacant. It is absolutely empty. And what I'm going to say to you is that this story that the Temple Mount is the third holiest site in Islam is an invention of recent time. It was never really considered the third holiest site in Islam until after 1967, when the Jews conquered East Jerusalem. Then they started making that claim in order to deny the legitimacy of the Jews to this site. This is what it was like now in the 19th century. Here's a picture, a drawing from about the same period of time as the last slide, but now we're looking at Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is the southern end. And once again, it's so interesting when you look at this. Remember, Al-Aqsa Mosque is on that same platform. You've got these pavement stones. Where are the pavement stones? Take a look at this. I don't see any pavement stones in that drawing, do you? Instead, it's hilly. What you have here is an accumulation of dirt over the many, many years, and it's all overgrown with weeds. Look at these weeds. Look at the vegetation growing up out of that. This is not a holy site. And once again, I mean, very, very few people in this drawing. This is the Temple Mount in the 19th century, late 19th century. It's almost devoid of people. It's overgrown with weeds. It's neglected. It's ill-kept. There's nothing really going on. Now, by contrast, look at this picture and contrast it with the next picture, which is Al-Aqsa Mosque today. Look at that. Same place, same structure, but now you can see the pavement stones. They've all been swept clean. They sprayed Roundup there. No, I don't know if they sprayed Roundup, but the weeds are all gone. And look at all the people. This is what it looks like today. You go there any day of the week, and there are masses of people there. Why the difference? Why the difference? That's because they're giving us this purported reason why they're so interested in the Temple Mount, because they're claiming it as the third holiest site in Islam. And yet, even in Islam, there are many scholars who call into question the literal journey of Muhammad to Jerusalem. In many of the mystical sects of Islam, they don't believe that at all. In fact, many sects and offshoots belonging to Islamic mysticism interpret Muhammad's night ascent, the Isra and Mi'raj, to be an out-of-body experience through non-physical environments, unlike the Sunni Muslims or mainstream Islam. The mystics claim that Muhammad was transported to Jerusalem and onward to seven heavens, even though, quote, the apostles' body remained where it was, namely in Mecca. Esoteric interpretations of Islam emphasize the spiritual significance of Mi'raj, seeing it as a symbol of the soul's journey and the potential of humans to rise above the comforts of material life through prayer, piety, and discipline. And I would submit to you that this is much closer to the truth about what happened in the background of Surah 17. Muhammad had a vision. In his vision, he travels to the farthest mosque, not even Jerusalem, because there in other Islamic writings, the very same expression, the farthest mosque, Al-Aqsa, is actually a reference to heaven. So in the vision, Muhammad travels from Mecca to heaven. Jerusalem is nowhere mentioned in the holy book of Islam and was probably not even envisioned by Muhammad. Muhammad lived almost all of his life only in Saudi Arabia. Now it's true, he traveled in caravans with his uncle when he was a teenager, and he might possibly have visited Jerusalem, had some knowledge about Jerusalem, but he was basically an Arab, limited to the Arab peninsula. He lived out his life there and he died there. He had no interest in Jerusalem, no purpose in going there. And so the Temple Mount continues to be a place of concern for Muslims to this very day. As you know, in recent years, there have been a number of riots that have erupted on the Temple Mount, giving rise to increased tensions throughout the land of Israel. Many times, the rioters emerge from the Al-Aqsa Mosque, throwing stones at the police and at anybody else that happens to be around. And so, just a few weeks ago, John Kerry was in the Middle East, and he met with the Jordanians and with the Muslim authorities, with the backing and the support of the Israeli authorities, and they arrived at something that might help to calm things down on the Temple Mount. They said, let's install surveillance cameras, and then we can keep an eye on what's going on, and maybe we can stop these things before they develop. And everybody was in agreement, yeah, we should do that. Well, here now, just in the last week or two, this is from March 19th, right here, 2016, from the Jordan Times, most recent development with relation to these cameras that are to be installed And the king of Jordan said they're going to be installed in just a few more days, back here on the 19th. Surveillance cameras will be installed at Al-Aqsa Mosque in the coming few days to cover the courtyards of Al-Haram al-Sharif, that's the Islamic name for the Temple Mount, the noble sanctuary. In the coming few days, government spokesman Mohammed Momani said Friday. In remarks to Jordanian television, Momani, who is also Minister for the State Media Affairs and Communications, said no cameras will be installed in prayer areas in the mosque because, watch this, he says now the goal is to record any Israeli violations. When in truth, the problem has been the Arabs have been coming out of Al-Aqsa Mosque and throwing stones that they've been storing there. But what the Palestinians are now saying is if you install cameras inside the mosque, we're going to destroy them. And so now the Jordanians are backing down and saying, oh, no, don't get upset. We're not going to put any cameras in there inside the mosque. Instead, we're just going to install them outside. We're only going to keep watch over the Israelis because they're really the bad guys. So this is all going on, and it's all related to this built-up claim that the Temple Mount is the so-called third holy site in Islam. It's a fabrication. It was not true until 1967, and since 1967 they have built up this whole sort of myth and idea that this is an extremely holy site for Islam. Well, on Friday I want to get to the real answer, why the Muslims are so interested in the Temple Mount.